Hello and welcome to today's presentation where we are going to talk about the penalties for contravening environmental laws in South Africa. So, there are various categories of penalties which a violator can be subjected to. Directives and compliance notices issued in terms of NEMA, which is the National Environmental Management Act, for example, do indirectly impose certain forms of penalties on the violator. These include being forced to rehabilitate environmental damage on site. The other category of penalties include admission of guilt fines. Administrative fines are usually incurred when a violator wishes to rectify an unlawful development. The last category of penalties are criminal convictions, where a violator who is convicted can be thrown in prison or pay a fine or be subjected to both fine and imprisonment. Some criminal convictions also include an order for payment of the costs of environmental rehabilitation and even the costs of scientific investigations. An example of an admission of guilt fine can be found in our Waste Act. A person who's caught, for example, illegally dumping waste can admit guilt, and he or she can end up paying a maximum fine of 5,000 rand. So let's look at the Waste Act and the penalty provisions under this act. A person who fails to comply with a condition in a waste management license could end up paying a maximum fine of 10 million rand or 10 years imprisonment or both. And for example, contravening or failing to comply with a waste norm or standard can set you back 5 million rand or 5 years imprisonment or both. NEMA Section 24G is one of the provisions in the Act which allows a person who has commenced an activity unlawfully without environmental authorization. It allows them to apply to have that unlawfulness, if you want to put it, rectified. So it's also called a rectification of unlawful commencement application. But in order to rectify this unlawfulness or have the authorities contemplate an application under Section 24G, a maximum fine payable is 5 million rand. And with the new amendments to NEMA, when they come into effect, this maximum fine will increase to 10 million rand. Another example of an administrative fine can be found in the Air Quality Act. It has a provision similar to Section 24G, but where a person has operated or conducted an activity without an emission license. The maximum fine, administrative fine here payable would be 10 million rand. But this comes into effect only when the National Environmental Management Laws Amendment Act 2022 comes into effect. The other category of offences under the Air Quality Act include a maximum fine of 5 million rand or 5 years imprisonment or both, and then a 10 million rand fine or 10 years imprisonment or both for a subsequent conviction under the Air Quality Act. Now, a person who commences a listed activity without going through an EIA process and without getting environmental authorization can also be subject to a maximum fine of 10 million rand or 10 years imprisonment or both. Other offences under this category of penalties include non-compliance with the conditions of an environmental authorization or an environmental management program. Another category of penalties under NEMA is a maximum fine of 5 million rand or 5 years imprisonment or both. A somewhat interesting offence under this category is that of threatening to take disciplinary action against an employee for protected disclosures concerning an environmental risk. The other category of offences, or the other category of penalties under the Act is a 1 year imprisonment or fine. And a typical offence under this category would be if one fails to comply with the request of an EMI. An EMI is an environmental management inspector, and also commonly referred to as the Green Scorpions. And further clarity in terms of this penalty will be provided when the new NEMA amendments come into effect, where it includes a 1 million rand fine as penalty. So it will be a 1 year imprisonment or 1 million rand fine, or both on conviction. So an example of direct imprisonment of a director of a firm can be found in the case of Blue Platinum Ventures, where Matome Maponya, who's the director of Blue Platinum Ventures, he was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment, which was suspended for 5 years on condition that the damage done by the company's mining operations be rehabilitated within 3 months. So this was I think it was the first example of direct imprisonment without the option of a fine imposed on a director of a firm for environmental crimes. In the case of the state versus EnviroServe Waste Management, EnviroServe entered a guilty plea for offences committed in terms of environmental law, and they were convicted and sentenced to a 4 million rand fine. In the case of the state versus ArcelorMittal South Africa, they entered a guilty plea for not complying with the conditions of their air emission license, and they ended up with a 10,000 rand fine, while in terms of section 34(3)(b) of NEMA, they were also ordered to pay an amount of 3.6 million to the Department of Environmental Affairs for air quality monitoring instruments for the Sedibeng municipality. In the case of State versus Woodglaze Trading Pty Limited, they entered a guilty plea for contravening the Waste Act, the National Water Act and NEMA, and they were slapped with a 2.5 million rand fine, as well as being ordered to appoint a multidisciplinary specialized team to rehabilitate the wetland which was damaged as a result of the offence. So what you've seen are basically examples or reasons why you should make environmental compliance your priority. So here's a list of proactive interventions for environmental compliance. So number 1, conduct a proper screening of your proposed projects. Find out what your legal obligations are in terms of our environmental laws. 2, ensure that your development or your operations have all the necessary environmental approvals or permits. 3, monitor compliance. Monitor compliance with your permits, your authorizations, and the associated conditions, and monitor these through an auditing process. 4, respond promptly to public or stakeholder complaints. 5. Take prompt action whenever you detect environmental non-compliance. So that's it for today. Thank you for listening to this presentation. So if you need to get in contact with me, or if you need further information, all my contact details are at www.sami.co.za.